I realized at some point I needed to retire, and I wanted to go on and do other things, things in philanthropy and doing more experimental kind of films. But I've been a big fan of Disney all my life. These are my kids. So
all those Star Wars films.
All the Star Wars films.
They were your kids.
Yeah, well, they are. I loved them. I created them. I'm very intimately involved in them, and obviously to
and
sell
you
them
sold
off,
them.
I sold them to the white slavers that take these things and.
Okay, but.
Hello, everyone. In 2012, George Lucas sold the film, television, and merchandise rights to the cultural juggernaut known as Star Wars.
Star Wars, 1 billion years in the making, and it's coming to your galaxy this summer.
This deal was valued at approximately $4.5 billion. Citing his reason for selling to Disney, George Lucas said he wished to reduce his involvement in blockbuster filmmaking, focus on his family, and create independent, private projects. At the time, one might have thought this was a good, pragmatic decision on George's part. Since 1977, when Star Wars released, the intellectual property grew too big for one intellect. Culturally, the ramifications of output in the Star Wars universe, both when it was received positively and negatively, was overwhelming for one person to handle in terms of public relations. By way of course, maybe it was inevitable that a gargantuan, corporate, well-oiled machine like Disney would be the prime candidate, the ferryman to deliver the future of Star Wars after its wilderness era.
I really wanted to put the company somewhere in a larger entity which would protect it. Disney is a huge corporation. They have all kinds of capabilities and facilities, so that there's a lot of strength that is gained by this.
With the benefit of hindsight, such an approximation would turn out to be an industrial, apocalyptic, money-burning, fan-spliting tragedy, marked by a soft reboot which was beat-for-beat derivative of A New Hope, a latter sequel thereof that took all the mystery box setups from its predecessor and posed the question, what if nothing? Followed by a grand finale of the sequel trilogy where the director of that aforementioned first derivative reboot of A New Hope came back to subvert the subversion.
What are stories but mystery boxes?
Resulting in an absolute farcical multi-million-dollar argument between J.J. Abrams and Rian Johnson on what the legacy of Star Wars should be. I won't even name these sequels because they are irrelevant, not just to me but according to statistics on Nielsen ratings, where these sequels are not favoured by any range of demographic between babies and baby boomers. It was all a fetid, incoherent fever dream, and the fact that it was now 7 years ago would be a blessing, were it not for the umpteenth Disney Plus series squandering yet more of its canon, except for perhaps one project, which was written by someone who had no interest in making Star Wars that was self-referential of Star Wars, but instead an original, thoughtful story of rebellion in a sci-fi setting. Where had we seen that before? In terms of the death of the author, which is the notion that the reader's interpretations are tantamount to the author's original intentions when discussing the art in question, a caveat we are forced to grapple with is what happens when the author relinquishes their rights to the intellectual property. Regardless of the art medium in question, the paradigm shift remains unchanged. The case of George Lucas is most apt, as he negotiated an amount of control of the film and merchandising rights that was unprecedented at the time for a singular person. Thus, when the Disney Corporation purchased the rights to Star Wars and Indiana Jones, the decision-making apparatus transitioned from being one man to a whole boardroom. In a litigious sense, the death of the author had already occurred in respect to George Lucas, as he was no longer the man with the answers, nor the person who would want to be bothered with the questions. Specifically when Disney wiped the extended universe of Star Wars and retconned elements of the timeline set during the original 6 movies. In a loyalist and purist sense, a percentage of the fans, myself included, would not consider Disney's alterations canon and instead label them as high-budget fanfiction. We encounter a problem, though, as more time passes and Disney's output in accord with their changes to the canon far exceed the original slate in quantity, exacerbated to the point where Gen Alpha might grow up to call Yoda Old Man Grogu. There is a continuous epidemic of previously criticised installments in franchises being looked back on, nostalgically, through the subsequent zeitgeist of how much worse the future turned out to be for the franchise. Star Wars is by no means alone in this. Fans of Terminator, Predator, Ghostbusters, Alien, Tron, Marvel, just to name a few, have had recent installments whose lack of characters have had fans missing superficial characterization, whose inconsistent and self-contradicting themes have had fans missing the shallow philosophical ramifications of stories, and whose mean-spirited, ideologically obsessed undertones have had people missing times when the films were just unapologetically trying to entertain the world, rather than trying to change it. Make a bad film necessarily, these elements alone do not. But combined, the result is embarrassing. Star Wars is nonetheless supremely unique to this effect. The day George Lucas sold his intellectual property was a singular nexus event that no other franchise can match in terms of impact on pop culture. Are the fans to blame for George Lucas selling out? No, I would not say so, because fans do not know the future, time is linear, and implying that Star Wars' destruction was inevitable after losing its original creator gives both George Lucas and Disney far too much credit. It has been proven with Tony Gilroy's Andor series that Star Wars can thrive, to a degree, beyond its original creator. It also gives Disney too much credit as it suggests there was nothing they could have done to subvert the staggering current irrelevance of Star Wars. Writers to this degree are supposed to be professionals. They are arguably overpaid for doing something that a lot of people deem relatively leisurely. So giving them so much leeway because the circumstances were challenging is not appropriate. D&D are not exempt from responsibility just because George R.R. Martin allowed them to surpass his books. With this said, using this Nexus event, we should simply moderate our behaviour as fans when criticising the latest output in franchises we have chosen to invest personal stake in. Because creators can do much worse than assassinate your favourite characters or destroy the world building or not ship your characters. They can become apathetic, and apathy is death.
Go to make a movie and all you do is get criticized, and people try to make decisions about what you're going to do before you do it. You know, it's not much fun, and you can't experiment.
Creators sell out when fans buy what they hate. In other words, if we persistently purchase installments in a franchise we have already lost faith in because of morbid curiosity, we as fans are funding their ability to sell out as their IP becomes immensely valuable. This is something which, in fairness, occurred on a uniquely large scale. In any other circumstance, it may not necessarily apply. There is the notion that critics of media who purchase and experience the subject of their criticism are perpetuating its existence in terms of finances and publicity. This is almost entirely a falsehood and could only be true under very specific, strange, and artificial circumstances. These content reviewers have large audiences who are influenced to not spend money on the product and instead experience a substituted version of the story via a podcast or a video essay breakdown instead. Nevertheless, there is such a thing as bad publicity, namely, a reputation that is catastrophic in the long term, despite its short-term bursts of radioactive toxic attention. Bad publicity can be intoxicating, completely gaslighting production studios into believing it is a greater good, to the point where Sony re-released Morbius in the cinemas as they thought that its Morbin Time memes translated into actual unironic interest. In the instance of George Lucas, though, the perfect storm was inadvertently created by Star Wars fans, bombarding him with the minority of abuse yet the majority of constructive criticism, regardless of how the latter crowd were being reasonable and simply expressing their misgivings on the execution of Darth Vader's origins. The sheer volume of it would render forgiven any creator considering altogether abandoning the fictional universe. In this age, another way it can be seen as the "perhaps I treated you too harshly" way is that at least George Lucas had a plan for a trilogy and stuck with it despite the false start. Better than the chaos of the Star Wars sequels, and better than the response from George R.R. Martin who, when he saw the backlash to Season 8 of Game of Thrones, which was based on his notes for the ending, began to shirk or greatly hesitate from the responsibility of finishing the story. The perceived failure of the Star Wars prequels was a cultural discussion touchstone. The amount of people saying they would never show their children them was not insignificant. Likewise, this has now shifted into those children now grown up, deciding to only show their children the saga of 6 movies. The cynical interpretation that this is indicative of the decline in standards of what the audience expects is absolutely reasonable. However, pop culture is not too big to fail, it is just too big to change. Some may fall to the wayside, explore niche avenues of entertainment and become more skeptical. The sad reality is ordinary people who do not have the time or interest to muse and deliberate over their media diet will always gravitate to blockbusters and popular culture. Similarly, they will not have the time to find more sophisticated new independent media for their children to watch. Therefore, it is supremely important to dissect and expose what is wrong with modern, popular media, with sloppy writing, shallow mechanics, and spiteful inhibitions. Even worse when media is overly praised for not having one of those issues, exempting it from criticism for the rest. We are in a new world of slop, and all there is for us to do is to be so bold, or quite frankly naive, as to assert that pushing the original creator away with disproportionate criticism, and rolling the dice for a new mind to take over, is clearly not anywhere near worth the risk in this climate. I believe we must moderate the relationship between creator and consumer, in lieu of either getting no future installments in our favourite fictional universes at all, or getting another parasitic, skin-walking ending sprouting from the original intended ending. Is it reasonable to believe that Star Wars would be in a better place now had George Lucas maintained control over the IP, regardless of how hands-on or passive his leadership? Star Wars and Indiana Jones is in an abysmal shell state compared to its former self. However, it now stands for us to scrutinise the optimistic view in the original creator's favour, due to the dynamic in the production of the prequel trilogy of Star Wars. After George Lucas had accrued a passionate and sometimes irreverent following in the decades between Return of the Jedi and The Phantom Menace, it is said George Lucas was surrounded by yes-men, lacking the skeptics questioning his every decision during the original trilogy, forcing the creative output to contain far more refined, justified and lean implementations to the story, particularly regarding the budget and technology constraints of filming in the late 70s and early 80s. It would seem the polar opposite conditions were met with during the prequel era, since George Lucas's many whims were untrammelled by neither interpersonal or technological limitations. With this said, I urge people to consider that whimsy comes from the passion of one person acting solely in the interest of their creative vision, and, I guarantee you, this is preferable to an overcrowded writer's room comprised of people who are simply contractually bound to be there. A trilogy sourced from the same consistent whimsy and naivety is better than 2 or more of them clashing against one another. The reason there was only one man to blame for everything wrong with the prequel trilogy, and the parallel reason for there being an entire detective investigation board of people to blame for the Disney sequel trilogy to the point where they shift the blame to one another, encapsulates why one ended up worse. No matter how much disgruntled fans may wish ill on the creators of their favourite stories, the author is very much alive, at least in this case. The death of the author as an interpretive device is not here to pretend they are not around or do not hold the rights to create their story however they see fit. You could adopt a reality to the contrary, akin to how Kathleen Kennedy talked in that interview about George Lucas and what he would have wanted, as if he was already deceased.
There isn't a day that goes by or went by as we were making the movie where we don't talk about George. You know, it's the standard, what would George do?
Perhaps the creators of your beloved works of fiction must be seen as those flawed, troubled relatives you just have to deal with. Take your attention elsewhere and seek out other artists, instead of trying to remold the mind of an author that had already calcified before they even started writing. Whether or not criticism levied towards art is of an objective or subjective nature, Do not overestimate the patience of a creator who is simply a person who would like to pay their mortgage and feed their children.
I'm retired.
Are you bored of retired yet? Are you bored yet? You know?
I'm really happy.
Do you still
Don't let morbid curiosity override your actual worthwhile interests. I'm not simply saying if you don't like it, don't buy it. I'm saying if you like it, but in its current state it is not what it's supposed to be, then don't buy it. Do not reward and increase the fiscal value of something you deem to be critically decreasing. It is often said that nobody hates Star Wars more right now than Star Wars fans. Even if this is said with irony, it does not escape the bleak state of affairs. A more recent example is the creator of the amazing digital circus, who became exhausted towards the IP, just as its popularity hit its highest peak yet. When international cinemas brought it in alongside official merchandising, as well as Netflix hosting it on their streaming service despite it eventually being free on YouTube. This is usually the warning sign before a creator sells their IP in order to relieve themselves from the burden it has become. The only way it could become easier to reconcile this was if, for some reason, everyone was given access to create for the IP.